I have been an atheist for nearly a decade, but have not waded into the historicity of Jesus conversations because it never really mattered to me. Jesus could have existed, but that's rather mundane. It's the supernatural stuff that mattered, not the mundane. I avoided these conversations until late last year when I really decided to start digging into the subject. And it was then that I discovered that a lot of atheists don't think Jesus ever existed. Digging deeper, I found that most of those same people don't know why they don't believe. I must ask, is that proper skepticism? Or is it easier to just hand wave away Christianity by stating Jesus was just a myth? Based on the comments I've read, the people I've spoken with, and the videos I've watched, I have come to the conclusion it is the latter. I say this because while I straddled the fence, Dean Meadows and I met at Rogers State University in Claremore, Oklahoma, to debate the resurrection of Jesus. In my opening statement, I mentioned various gods and goddesses who had supposedly died and risen from the dead. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was only speaking that which I had been told, not that which I had researched. And that was a mistake. And while my interlocutor did not capitalize on it, I now use it as a personal example of the necessity of study. Now, mythicism, and I'm using the term most used in common parlance, is not a new phenomenon. I'd like to thank Chris Hansen for providing me a quick reference for the history of mythicism, and I'm going to quote them here. Historically, much of what we find in the critical studies of mythicists, especially the more respectable highbrow ones, is to be found in the work of Bruno Bauer, and those who later ran with his theories, Albert Kalthoff and Arthur Drebs. Now, Bauer basically deconstructed the historicity of the Gospels and argued that they were literary works, not historical ones. He then argued for there to be a great influence from Stoicism and Philo of Alexandria's philosophies on them as well. Now, for him and Kalthoff, Jesus was the personification of the societal wants and the desires of 2nd century CE. Bauer and Fraser were both then utilized, along with some astrotheology, by Arthur Drebs, who became easily the most widely known mythicist in history, easily sparking the greatest historical Jesus controversy to have ever happened on an international scale, prompting over 100 responses in 8 different languages. Fraser became secondarily important to mythicism because of this, and he later contributed to a foreword of the book The Enigma of Jesus by Paul-Louis Cauchoux, a French mythicist who is a forerunner of much of today's theories. Cauchoux presented the thesis that Paul had no conception of an earthly Jesus, but a purely celestial one, in a far more rigorous manner from his contemporaries. Cauchoux, Bauer, and Drebs had great influence to the present day. From them is derived the work of G.A. Wells, who then influenced Earl Dougherty, who in turn is the one who convinced Richard Carrier, who draws much of his theory from Dougherty. Robert Price is the only academic with qualifications in New Testament studies currently out there. One can argue he is more important than Carrier on multiple grounds, especially being, after Wells, the most cited and most well-known mythicist in academic literature, and the only one with regular engagement or reviews from academics on his material. And I appreciate again Chris Hansen for that. Now, there are a small number of scholars and historians who are agnostic on the historicity of Jesus and hold academic positions, but they are outnumbered by the nearly universal academic consensus that Jesus of Nazareth was at least a historical person. The acceptance of a historical person should not be confused with the acceptance of supernatural abilities, attributes, and actions. It has nothing to do with being religious or accepting the tenets of any religion, much less following the religion. I personally believe we can validate the authenticity of Jesus using only the Bible. Extra biblical evidence helps to strengthen the position, and I believe they should be used together. Again, this doesn't mean we accept the supernatural claims made in the Bible. For instance, Luke mentions the Judean census in 6 CE. The same year Ethnarch Herod Archelaus was deposed, thus fully merging Iudea with the Roman Empire. Now, Publius Sulpicius Quirinius was named Legatus Augusti over all of Syria, which now included Iudea, and Coponius was named Prefect of Judea, the same position Pontius Pilate would hold from 26 to 36 CE. In the book of Acts, the same author of the book of Luke mentions a revolt against the census in which a Galilean named Judas, not the one you're thinking of, led a small revolt against the census before being executed by the Romans. These are bits of history which are attested extra-biblically, specifically by the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews. So we can say with confidence these parts of Luke are correct. Does this mean the supernatural birth of Jesus is true? Not at all. This is an error passed to the author by somebody who knew Jesus was born in Nazareth, which John also confirms, but needed to have him in Jerusalem to fulfill the out-of-context messianic prophecy found in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, saw the historical census and likely fit the mythological story there and hoped he was right or nobody would notice. Our ability, and more importantly, our willingness to set aside bias and follow where the evidence leads cannot be overstated when it comes to accepting or rejecting claims. But how do I think we can use the Bible to verify the existence of the historical Jesus? I'm going to provide a list of examples and go into detail on a couple after completing this not at all exhaustive list. And again, I like to stay biblically. Well, there is Mark. The Gospel of Mark, right around 70 CE, was not written in Palestine, meaning the author also has his source from Palestine. It can be said that Matthew and Luke are not independent in their entirety, especially Matthew, but even so, there is the saying source, as well as two independent sources for the parts of both books. These are known as Q, M, and L. And I can't wait for some of you to tell me how wrong I am about this part. Don't worry, it's coming. Luke specifically says in chapter 1 of his book, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account, which provides us with an unknown number of additional sources, all of them prior to 80 or 85 CE. Of course, there's the independent Gospel of John, as well as the author's sources. You have the signs source, the signs of Jesus, the Passion narrative, a couple of accounts of what Jesus said and did. Now, one could point to the Gospels and say they were legendary accounts, an amalgamation of characters put together over the course of 40 to 70 years. I've heard that and even considered it. But should we accept it? We need to also look outside the Gospels at the most important figure in early Christianity, the Apostle Paul. Paul converted to Christianity and was speaking in Palestine, in Judea, in Jerusalem, the city where they crucified Jesus, about the same man just 2 years after Jesus was crucified. Paul personally knew James, the brother of Jesus. He knew Peter, the number one disciple, and John, son of Zebedee. And because somebody challenged me saying that Paul never met John, read Galatians chapter 2, verse 9. There are some words in the New Testament that are written in Aramaic instead of Greek, including part of Mark chapter 5 and John chapter 1. In my opinion, Mark chapter 2 verses 27 to 28 is the best example of this. It says this: Jesus is responding to the Pharisees who are asking them, "Why are you doing shit on Sundays?" Not Sundays, the Sabbath. He responded and said, "Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath." So a few things about that. Number one, it doesn't make any sense. How could the Son of Man be the logical conclusion to this statement? Now, it can't be, because if the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, then there is no conclusion that includes Son of Man. So what happened? Well, this is actually easy to explain, and we can see it in the text. The source who told this to the author of the Gospel of Mark either relayed it to him or spoke Aramaic himself and understood there is no difference in Aramaic between the words man and Son of Man. They are both the same word, bar enash. This means when it was relayed to the author, This is what it said. Sabbath was made for Bar Enosh, not Bar Enosh for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Bar Enosh is the Lord of the Sabbath. The meaning is quite clear. Man is Lord of the Sabbath, period. The writer of the book translated it into Greek and made Jesus the Lord of the Sabbath. And that's very easy to do. Because it was in Aramaic, the language spoken in Palestine at the time, it shows an oral tradition which extends back at least a generation. Jesus' baptism. We can state that it happened even without supernatural claims. Because John the Baptist existed, we know that through Josephus, and was baptizing people as his name would apply. Early Christians would not have added that later because the person being baptized, this is what they saw this as, they saw the person being baptized as spiritually inferior to the one doing the baptism. This passes the criterion of dissimilarity. There are 12 independent sources throughout the rest of the New Testament, and none of them, outside maybe 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, had access to the Gospels. This is nearly overwhelming evidence showing knowledge of Jesus before and after the time of his death. Now, there's some extra biblical stuff by Jewish writers. We have, First Clement, and that's partially pseudepigraphical, sure, but we also have the Didache. The words and writings of these apostles. Now, this conversation would not be happening without mythicism type positions. And again, I'm using the phrase that is most commonly used in parlance. I appreciate Mettinger's, even Wells's work on the dying and rising gods, but this is a view that isn't accepted by most historians. Jonathan Smith's critique of Fraser's The Golden Bough really shows the vast majority of scholars don't accept it either, and those gods, as I'm going to get into, either don't die at all, or they die and they don't return. Adonis, Baal, Marduk, Osiris, Dumuzi. Adonis was killed by a boar. He doesn't come back from the dead. Anything about his resurrection was added long after Ovid had died. Osiris is murdered and dismembered, thanks for the graphic details Plutarch. Isis does reassemble him, kinda. They don't find his, I believe Plutarch says member. And so she makes one, and then they put it and they toss it out to sea, basically. And that's actually what they worship now, or they worshipped with the Osirian myths. His member, his penis, his cock. And he doesn't come back to life either. Now, by the way, I recommend Mark Smith's works on ancient Near East religions. And there is no evidence that we have at all of any pagans prior to Christianity believing in dying and rising gods, or that it was widespread. Even more than that, it was not worshipped in early Palestine. We have no evidence of that. But the main reason to consider that Jesus was not a myth based upon those, and I've gone over this many, many times, neither Jesus nor his disciples or his early followers believed he was a god. He never claimed to be a god, and his disciples saw the Messiah, the anointed one, not as a god, but rather the coming king of Israel. So the dying and rising myth doesn't work at all. I've heard mythicists attempt to state Tacitus's Annals, 1544, which speaks about the Roman fire and the Christian persecution at the hands of Emperor Nero in 64 CE, is at least partially interpolated. That means forged, by the way. Namely this portion, which says Christus, from whom the name had its origin, speaking about Christianity. Now, the mythicist position here is that Christians later added it, oftentimes focusing on a single word, the spelling Christianos versus Christianos. But this is likely a textual error more than a later interpolation, and two reasons for that. It is well known that Tacitus had a disdain for the Christians. And second, scribes wouldn't have added it later because of how negative it appears toward Christians, and thus again passing the criterion of dissimilarity. I looked and looked and looked and could not find any current scholar who holds the position that it was an interpolation or anything other than a minor textual error by a person who wasn't exactly the best at Latin. With that being said, I also don't accept his position. I don't think that what he says happened in 64 actually happened. I think he wrote it, and I think that he understood the Christians were because of a historical person named Jesus, but I don't accept the fact that there was anybody that was actually martyred or murdered in the 64 CE fire. So you can do that. You can accept something historically and yet remove, because it has dates, but yet remove the claims from it. And of course, I suppose I probably wouldn't be a proper defender of history if I didn't bring up Josephus, specifically Testimonium Flavianum. Now, if you're an atheist, you've heard this one, you think you know what I'm going to say. It's in Book 17 of Antiquities and says this. At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one can call him a man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure, and he gained a following both among many Jews and many Greek origin. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, living again, just as divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. And up to this day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. Now that is the interpolation, right? Kinda. Part of it is. Not the entire thing, though. If we remove the Christian parts of that text, this is what we're left with. At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so, and up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out. This is something Josephus would write. He would not include the other pieces because he was a Jew. He wouldn't call somebody like that the Messiah. And he certainly wouldn't say that he rose again. He certainly wouldn't say anything about him, about the deeds that he performed and wondrous works. But he would say these things because we actually can look and see where he says other things about other people that are much the same. And there's additional evidence for this as well. Because we have in Antiquities Book 20, Part 9, a reference to James, the brother of Jesus. And it says this: When therefore Ananus was of his disposition, he thought he now had a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before him the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. This is not an interpolation. This is the historical record of Josephus. These are things that he would say. That is absolutely what he would say about most everything. Here's the thing. That is a historical reference to James, the brother of Jesus. But even more than that, it's also, this is the part, again, where I mentioned this. What do we hear about James? We hear about James saying that James the Just, right, was martyred. And we can find that martyrdom in Antiquities, Book 20, Part 9. Well, what do we find in Book 20, Part 9? We find that James the Just, call him that, sure, James, the brother of Jesus, was delivered up and hauled away to be stoned. But to be stoned for what? In fact, there is no reference. There is nothing that says that he was martyred. In fact, if I remember properly, he didn't even die until later. So one can say, I accept this right here without adding my own additional information to it and attempting to state that this actually says that this is where we can see he was martyred for his faith. We don't know that, and we cannot say that. In fact, I would say that we don't know that any of the disciples of Jesus were martyred for their faith. And that would also include Paul. Now regarding Q, because some of y'all mofos can't let it go. The Q thing is a little technical, but there's no way, and there's really no way that I can do the topic any kind of justice right now, or even in conversation. We could have a lot of conversations. But I will, to the best of my ability, attempt to truncate the information and make it easy to understand. And we'll include links to scholarly sources in the description. Promise. So I've read Mark Goodacre's writings on the saying source. Named that because it contains really only the words of Jesus. Now it's called Quelle because it is German. That's German for source, by the way. And is usually shortened to just Q. So if you wonder where that comes from, that's it. It's a saying source. It's words of Jesus, and it includes the Beatitudes and Sermon on the Mount. Or his temptation, sorry. But I do not find Goodacre's stuff compelling for a number of reasons. Goodacre, by the way, is a professor at Duke University. He's an incredibly gifted scholar and an amazing person. I don't agree with him on this position, and I know that the majority of people, majority of scholars, of which I am not, don't. He is in an incredible minority. So anybody stating, as I have heard recently, that Q is losing favor among those who spend their lives studying these works is simply mistaken. In fact, I was reading a paper about it from 2019. But why do the overwhelming majority of scholars accept Q as a factual historical document which has been lost to history? First, the claim. What is Q? Here is the claim from Mythicist. The author of Matthew copied much of the Gospel of Mark and made his own additions. Then, the author of Luke copied from Matthew, which included the stories found in Matthew but not in Mark. There is no need for a Q document. On its surface, this seems to make sense. I can see that. However, we must never ever stop at the surface. On the contrary, we must consider that the beginning. Many stories appear in all three Gospels, and each time they appear in the same order, if they are in all three. When we find these stories which have been added to Matthew and Luke, the differences are easy to see. The different stories. One of the biggest things here is nearly every instance of shared sayings that appear only in Matthew and Luke are at different times in their Gospels. So, in order to explain this, it's an illustration that I didn't create, but I like to use. Let's say that we denote numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to the stories that are found in all three Gospels. And then we add a letter, A, B, C, D, E, to the stories found in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So basically, the story that's found in Matthew and Luke, there's A. And the story, and then there's B. And so there you go. You place them in a sequence and then find out where they're located in each Gospel. Here is what we find, right? Nearly every numbered story is in the same place in all three books. So wherever you would look to find a story in the book of Mark, you would see it in the same place in the life of Jesus and in the works of Jesus in about the same spot. When we input the letters, we see the stories are almost universally not in the same places in Matthew and Luke. What we find in Matthew is something like this. We have 1, 2A, 3B, 4C, 5DE. Matthew splits a bunch of the stories up. In Luke, it sounds something more like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, 5, 6, D, E, F. The book of Luke, on the other hand, puts it in different places, but puts them all together. He puts large chunks of them together. This shows us that Matthew and Luke had access to a document or multiple copies of the document or with slight variations and put them in their Gospels. This shows that there were many of these stories regarding the actual person of Jesus circulating in Palestine in the first half of the first century. Now, does this mean that the supernatural claims are true again? No. In fact, we don't actually know if there's a passion narrative that's attached to the gospel. The gospel is by the way, sometimes, you can call it the gospel of Q. So, just so you know. It's...
I always just thought it was the Q source.
Yeah,
there's... Think of it as the gospel of Q.
A lot of people that have the idea that it has a passion narrative,
yeah,
we'll call it gospel. So, yeah, it's a saying source.
Huh.
It's lost to time. Would like it they found it. But it just lends credence to the historical person of Jesus. Now, I mentioned I was going to get back to the dying and rising gods, and I absolutely am. So, Carrier, who I would say is probably most popular among most of the atheists that I know, often references James George Fraser's Dying and Rising Gods, which is something I mentioned as an earlier mistake that I made. I won't get into his incorrect assertion that Jesus was crucified by demons in space, but that's also important for somebody to look into as well, and to see how non-biblical it is and non-historical it is.
Can I do a video on that?
If you want to.
Yes!
So how did they die? Is it similar to Jesus, these dying and rising gods? Well, the deaths of Osiris, who was sealed in a coffin and pushed out to sea, Attis, who bled to death after castrating himself in a fit of madness, Heracles, who was poisoned and burnt alive, Dionysus, dismembered, boiled, roasted like Louisiana crawfish, and eaten by the Titans, are all similar to Jesus in that they died, but none of them came back to life. The real similarity is that they all suffered immense pain and shame, like Jesus. Other aspects of their lives, especially any claims regarding any resurrection, do not at all parallel Jesus. In this way, those mentioning the dying and rising gods are ignoring the multitude of evidence against this position while attempting to fit around Jesus into a square mythological peg that doesn't seem to exist. What about their resurrection, though? As I mentioned, did they even resurrect? One of my favorite stories, that of Attis, is told in multiple anthologies, but he doesn't come back from the dead in any of them. At best, his body doesn't rot. His hair grows, and every once in a while we see a Superman-style pinky movement. The Romans worshipped him as an evergreen, cutting down the tree and symbolizing its still green branches as evidence that Attis survived in death. Not that he rose from the dead. Osiris is resurrected, if you want to call it that, but he isn't resurrected back to life. He becomes the ruler of the underworld and is unable to return to the land of the living. Richard Carrier says that Christ and Osiris, quote, both end up living as lords in heaven, but that is simply false. What about why they died? This is important as well, right? None of the dying gods die of their own free will. Adonis is gored by a boar, which I apparently spelled wrong. Osiris is tricked. Attis is driven mad. Baal is murdered, and I mean destroyed in battle. And Nana is the only one where you can even partially make a connection about that she made the decision because she walked up to the underworld of her own volition. Even so, she did not willingly give up her power or clothing. She was tricked into doing it. Only the Christian deity Jesus gives up his own life of his own accord. His death is a conscious sacrifice, an act of substitution. This factor alone makes the mythos of Christ's death significantly different from other so-called dying and rising deities. The others are also cyclical. Jesus' resurrection is not. It means the same thing today as it did 2,000 years ago. Even more unique, Jesus set the model for how those who follow him will also resurrect. So, the dying and rising gods thing needs to die. Now, regarding Carrier, he uses Bayes' theorem to measure the probability of Jesus' historical existence. This seems to make sense in mathematics, but he faces a theorem which is also used by Christians, as I've recently discovered, to show it's most likely Jesus rose from the dead. So how can a theorem, if used properly, both show a person didn't likely exist at all and that person also likely rose from the dead? Both Carrier and Price use what is known as the Rank-Raglan hero archetype method to deduce the likelihood that a person is mythical. Now, this is where I have an incredible separation from Carrier and find him to be more than a bit dishonest. Basically, the Rank-Raglan is two different sets of attributes that a so-called person would have, either 12 or 22, depending on which way you go with it. And here are some of them. These are actually the 22 that Carrier used. The hero's mother is a royal virgin. His father is a king. He's often a near relative of his mother, but the circumstances of his conception are unusual. He's reputed to be the son of a god. At a birth, an attempt is made, usually by his father or his maternal grandfather, to kill him, but he is spirited away and is reared by foster parents in a faraway country. We are told nothing about his childhood, but upon reaching manhood, he returns or goes to his future kingdom. After a victory over the king and or giant, dragon, wild beast, centaur, I don't know, he marries a princess, often the daughter of the predecessor, and becomes king. For a time he reigns uneventfully and prescribes laws, but later he loses favor with the gods and or his subjects and is driven from the throne or the city, after which he meets a mysterious death, often on the top of a hill. His children, if any do succeed him, watch, and his body is not buried, but nevertheless he has one or more holy sepulchres. Now, Carrier assigns Jesus 2 different scores. The book of Mark, 14, the book of Matthew, 20 of the 22. This is well above his stated mythical threshold of 11. But here's the rub. Carrier changes Raglan's traditional list and does not inform his readers how and why he is doing it. I'm going to quote from Galata. He changes the specificity of the hero's mother is a royal virgin to the more ambiguous, the hero's mother is a virgin. He modifies that the hero's father is a king to a far more open, father is a king or the heir of a king, in order to include Jesus' claimed Davidic lineage. He also excludes from this scale that the attempt on the hero's life at birth is usually by his father or his maternal grandfather. He adds the qualifying one or more foster parents when the hero is spirited away to a faraway country, while Raglan, as you remember, only states foster parents. A significant change Carrier makes is that the hero is only crowned, hailed, or becomes king, whereas Raglan states that the hero becomes king. Another important change made by Carrier is that the hero's body turns up missing, whereas Raglan's list has the body is not buried. This, by the way, is from On the Historicity of Jesus. It's no wonder Jesus scored so highly. This is dishonest bullshit and is no different than what we call out apologists and those peddling young earth creationist bullshit for doing. He began, as they do, with the presupposition that Jesus did not exist and searched for ways to meld the evidence so as to tilt the scales in his favor. What kind of PhD holding graduate from Columbia University should need to be so dishonest in their position? This isn't skepticism, it's outright pushing a position he claims not to care where it ends. Regarding another God, Haile Selassie. These things were about this God. The coming to earth of a messianic figure who was prophesied in the Old Testament. A birth accompanied by miracles, a child with immense, divinely given wisdom who possessed miraculous powers. A Messiah whose actions were prefigured in Old Testament writings. A man who could perform miracles and in whose presence miracles occurred. A man who was worshipped and held to be divine by thousands who had not even met him. A man who is the incarnation of God and continues to live on despite evidence of his death. A man who is prayed to and communicated with by his followers. And a Savior who will one day return to gather up a chosen people who will live under his rule in a kingdom of God. Based on those attributes, including being known as Lord of Lords, King of Kings, and conquering Lion of the tribe of Judah, and the fact that his followers said his body is missing, it would be easy to say, if we are to use the rank Raglan Carrier responses, that Selassie would be a mythical figure like Jesus. But no, a real person, born in Ethiopia in the late 19th century, was the leader of Ethiopia until he was murdered in a coup d'etat in 1975. And yet, even as an Orthodox Christian, he was the God figure, the Rastafarian religion. Strictly speaking, this type of hero archetype numeration is not accepted by scholars because it is ethnocentric, psychoanalytic, and is peddled by Freud. It also reaches crazy conclusions. For instance, the mythological stories of Abraham Lincoln were put to the test and received a perfect 22. Does that mean that Lincoln never existed? Speaking of historical figures, why not go back again to James, the brother of Jesus? In 2001, Steven Spielberg teamed up with Tom Hanks to produce the award-winning HBO miniseries Band of Brothers. It was based on Stephen Ambrose's book of the same name. The series follows the exploits of the men of Easy Company of the 506th Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division during World War II. From their training at Camp Toccoa in Georgia to jumping into Normandy, France, ahead of the D-Day invasion, to the center of the line in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, to taking Hitler's Eagle Nest. The men, commanded by Major Richard Winters, form a bond like one would expect of brothers. Just after midnight on June 6, 1944, they dropped behind enemy lines in Normandy, France, ahead of the next morning's D-Day invasion. Nothing went as expected. They were dropped all over the place. Some had no weapons. Winters rallied some of the members of Easy and, together with a paratrooper named Tex from another company, set out to complete their mission. They ambushed a German transport, and one member, Sergeant Gournier, ignores orders and kills all of the enemy without allowing a chance for surrender. Tex asks what his deal was. Gournier is an ass to him, and he's told about the gonorrhea nickname, and his response is, besides having a shitty name, what's his problem? And at twilight the next morning, just after the squad had formed pretty much up as much as they possibly could, they came across several paratroopers who had died during the jump and decided to procure supplies. As they were moving out, the Navy began shelling the beaches ahead of the soldiers who would be coming ashore. Tex looks at his watch and says, right on time. Gournier, pointing to a dead trooper, says, yeah, tell that to him, cowboy. And Tex responds, my name is Hall. Gournier shoots back, is that so? Hall looks bewildered and is told, you gotta realize it ain't about you. And then this exchange happens.
Shut your yap. His brother got at a casino. Found out before we jumped.
From the context, it's quite obvious Gournier's brother wasn't just another person who is part of their company or a person he is close with. While the show took liberties with his death, saying it was at the more well-known Monte Cassino instead of his actual death at the nearby town of Monteportia, it's obvious that this is Gournier's actual brother, Henry. This is a parallel with what Paul said about James, the brother of Jesus. In Galatians chapter 1, verses 18 to 19, Paul writes, then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas. And I stayed with him for 15 days, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. We know Paul existed. And if he's writing about James, who he met, and is calling him the actual brother of Jesus, there is no mythicist argument to be had. If anybody would know that Jesus existed, it would be his brothers. Mythicists read this and say something to the effect of, he meant James was the brother of Jesus like they were all brothers, much like in the Band of Brothers reference. This is where we get into lexicography, or the meaning of terms. In his writings, Paul refers to two different kinds of brothers, while using the same word, adelphos. The spiritual brother, much like was said of the brothers in Christ, and somebody of actual relation, born of the same mother. Carrier states it this way, and this gets a bit tricky, so I'll try to make it make sense. Paul, that was a cool noise, applies brother to someone who was baptized a Christian, but not an apostle. James was baptized, but not an apostle, but Cephas was an apostle, and therefore not merely a brother. This is why Paul separated them in the writing. Cephas was a Christian and an apostle, while James was simply a Christian. Now, Cephas, because of his position in the church, was always written first. So if you go back and listen to that about 18 times, it makes sense. Until one reads the rest of Paul's writings and discover he never uses that lexicon. Neither does anybody else in the New Testament, or in all of early Christian writing. The approach that is posited simply doesn't exist. Paul never makes the differentiation between those who are baptized but not apostles. He considers all Christians brothers. But even more than that, Paul writes that he had seen no other apostle but James, meaning he saw two apostles, Cephas and James. Why does Paul separate the two? Because the only difference is that James is also the actual brother of Jesus. Now, it is worth noting the author of the Gospels of Mark and John also include references to his brothers. Mark chapter 6 says, Jesus left that place and went back to his hometown, and his disciples followed them. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were utterly amazed. Where did this man get all his teachings, they asked. What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What great miracles are being done by his hands? This is the builder, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. His sisters are with us, aren't they? And they were offended by him. And then in John chapter 7, which is one of my favorite passages and my favorite of the canonical Gospels, it begins, after this, Jesus traveled about Galilee because he didn't want to travel to Judea since the Jewish leaders were trying to kill him. Now the Jewish festival of tents was approaching, so his brothers told him, you should leave this place and go to Judea so that your disciples can see the actions that you're doing. Since no one acts in secret if he wants to be known publicly. If you're going to do these things, you should reveal yourself to the world. Not even his brothers believed in him. And so we have independent sources for that as well. It is obvious in those passages what the writers of the Gospels are not speaking about brothers or sisters in Christ, but his actual family. Thus, we have evidence throughout the New Testament of that which is not only mundane, having brothers, by multiple sources both within and without of Palestine. It is also often spoken of by Paul and others in the first 2 to 3 years after the death of Jesus. Now, contrary to what I hear from mythicists and some other atheists, Paul also speaks of the historical Jesus a multitude of times throughout his writings. I can get into those in a different segment, but they are foundational when it comes to Paul's knowledge of the historical Jesus. Now, did Jesus exist? Yes, I believe this is the case. And I would state confidently that I believe I have submitted a strong case that if anyone were to view this without bias, refutes current mythicist positions, and firmly places Jesus where he belongs in history. And I'm going to finish with a quote from M. David Litwa, and it comes from the book How the Gospels Became History. Despite Jesus's being more believable to the public at large, hence his appearance on the History Channel and other documentary or programming, the historical Jesus is almost never the Jesus considered ultimately real by Christian believers. After all, believers worship a divine Jesus, one that historians cannot and can never give them. Historians often construct their versions of Jesus by picking apart the pieces of the Gospels, throwing away or reinterpreting the fantastical or unbelievable elements, and resynthesizing the historical or historicized bits into a plausible narrative. These new narratives never present a Christian deity, the superhuman savior of humanity. Therefore, what they construct is always incompatible in some measure with the gospel portrait presents a superhuman savior.